Hello folks. So I'm actually in the not Postgres, Open Source Summit India, Open Source India Summit, I think 2024, and I was wondering about what next for me, and I was thinking about also questions for people I'm meeting here. So actually, the founder of MariaDB is over here, so which is pretty great, right? So I was like, I should totally ask him some questions or discuss something with him. And I was wondering what to ask. And interestingly, I don't know enough about MariaDB, right? So I was like, what do I ask them? So and also, if I don't know enough, I can probably find a lot on the internet. But then uh, why ask some question that I can probably find answers to on the internet, right? So ask some question for which I can't find an answer to on the internet, or it's probably hard to find such an answer, or it's not like a simple answer, it's a complicated answer, and an answer keeps changing over time. It's a complicated question, and I was thinking about questions like how MariaDB, like there are not a lot of databases which are not backed by companies. Like there are many databases which are backed by companies, and very few databases which are not backed by companies, software companies, like for-profit companies. For example, this is not just databases. There are so many softwares, especially open source softwares. Closed source softwares is usually always backed by a company, created by a company, and sold. I don't know if there are free. I mean, there are of course free closed source softwares out there, and also sharewares where you can just share it for free, right? But usually closed source software is created for profit or some sort of thing. The thing is, what about open source softwares? And open source softwares, of course, the popular ones, I mean, not the small ones, the very, very popular ones which are used worldwide, globally. For example, programming languages like, say, Golang, Java, or Java is like pretty much global, right? So Oracle is a company that is backing Java, apart from so many other companies that is backing Java, and helping develop Java, create JDKs and JDK distributions, right? So many JDK distributions. For example, Amazon creates its own Corretto JDK distribution. So what about open source softwares that are not backed by a company, for-profit company, right? For example, Golang is also backed by Google, and this a lot of funding comes from Google, and a lot of Google engineers and all work on Golang, right? And they get paid. So there's funding, right? It's also about funding and backing by a company with money, with funding, which has a profit. It's a sustainable company, sustainable business, right? Organization which has money to fund the creation and the maintenance of an open source software. So in databases world, I think Postgres, for example, does not have any company backing it. I've heard the same for JavaScript. There's no company backing it. For Rust, I think there was. In open source software, I'm saying for Rust, for example, there was Mozilla, but now I think it has become some Rust Foundation similar to Apache Software Foundation. I don't know how they are a sustainable foundation, and as a business and whatnot. For example, Open Source India Summit has Apache Software Foundation as one of the booths. I wonder what they are pitching there, right? Or what they're selling. Like, are they selling services? And for example, Linux Foundation has services for teaching you stuff and getting certifications for Linux, for cybersecurity and whatnot, for Kubernetes. So Linux Foundation is the parent foundation of Cloud Native Computing Foundation, I believe. So So yeah, I mean, even Kubernetes related certifications and whatnot, I think they earn money like that, and probably they get funding and sponsoring from companies, and they probably earn from say conferences and all that, right? Running conferences, getting money from people registering for the conference, or from companies sponsoring the conference, right? Of course, running the conference itself will take some cost, but then of course they'll profit something. Now, when you look at open source software like Postgres, it's not backed by some particular organization, right? Of course, a lot of organizations contribute to open source Postgres. I don't know if there are folks of Postgres which are closed source and whatnot. For example, I think Quadrant is one company, Enterprise DB is one company, which is in the space of what do you say, Postgres, and these are companies that provide Postgres support, and they create things on top of Postgres, extensions and whatnot. For example, I remember someone mentioning years ago that master active replication or active mode, where it's not primary and replica, but instead it's a multi-master mode, is the feature is available in Postgres, but a enterprise thing. It's a paid thing, and I believe it was closed source, or maybe if you pay, you get the source code. I don't know. And so then it means it's closed source, because if it's open source, anyone can see it. It's on the out in the public, on the internet, and anyone can see it. But that's not the case, right? So Quadrant had it, I think, multi-master. And yeah, many companies contributing to Postgres, and but there's no one company to say, hey, we are backing Postgres. There are like multiple companies. It's a community, and there's a lot of open source community people working on it. And these people are usually working for some company which is in the database space, or it's in this just software space. So, for example, say Quadrant or Enterprise DB, or say companies like Percona, MyDBOps, right? Percona, MyDBOps, I think they provide their own distribution. Like, for example, Percona provides its own distribution of databases, open source databases. I wonder what's the sanctity in it. For example, if I compile the code, it will be the same binary. So I don't know exactly what is the sanctity, but they do provide their own distributions, and they provide support, right? They are experts in a lot of databases, like Postgres and whatnot. So, and I've seen them come to PostgreSConf and whatnot. And there are companies like MyDBOps which are also experts in databases, a lot of databases, like Postgres, and I think even MySQL, ScyllaDB and whatnot, and TIDB, Titanium Database, which is by PingCap, again backed by a company, by the way. So with all these like popular databases, Postgres is one of the databases where there's no one company backing it, and there's a community, and there are a lot of community of companies also, but there's no one company to say we own and decide what happens in Postgres. I think there is a Postgres development group. I think it's called PDG or something, and then there's like a global development group something. So I think they take decisions. It's basically who takes decisions, because sometimes you get scared about, like, say a language belongs to a company, or a software belongs to a company. The company can decide what they do with it, especially with open source software, right? For example, I think Rust, probably for a long time, it was all Mozilla, and then I think it's a good thing that they made it from Mozilla to its own Rust foundation, or whatever it is, so that the company does not now say, like, we own Rust and we can do anything with Rust. Of course, someone can clone or fork Rust, but yeah, I mean, any open source software you can do that. And Rust is basically what? It's a programming language, which means it's a specification and there's a implementation for it, right? So same for Java and whatnot. There are implementations, and that's why distributions, JDK, JRE, the runtime. So yeah, I mean, in case of say Postgres, now you have it's all open source and there's no company backing it. But say now I'm in Open Source India Summit and here there is MariaDB, which basically has the founder who actually created MySQL, the original version. I don't know exactly the relationship between the open source MySQL and the Oracle coming into the play and whatnot, and the MariaDB fork and whatnot, and how MariaDB and MySQL are different. Because when I was in university in like undergraduate course, that time I used to use I think MySQL or MariaDB, and I was just using the MySQL client, I think the CLI client. I installed it on Ubuntu, I think, because we were all using Ubuntu computers. So it's a basic install using apt install or apt get apt get and get MySQL or MariaDB or whatever, and just use the client CLI client after the server runs. And I didn't really learn much about MySQL after that. But then I'm wondering now what's the difference, and I mean, as a company, as MariaDB, like how do they even say something like, hey, you can actually use MariaDB instead of say Postgres? What are the difficulties when it comes to say a company backing a database versus no particular single company backing or owning a database? I mean, MariaDB could say it's open source. Anyone can do anything, right? So anyone can just clone and whatnot. But of course, it will have open source license, and you have to obey it ideally. And if you don't, someone can actually sue you, depending on the legality of it, right? Like how worse the the offenses. So yeah, I mean, a lot of people just like Postgres, and in general, like I mean, comparing say MariaDB and Postgres or MySQL Postgres and all that, like a lot of people might be like Postgres is not backed by some, I mean, like not owned by some particular company. It's by the community, and we will opt for it. We will adopt it. We'll opt for it because there's no company, and we'll self-host our Postgres. Now, how does MariaDB say stuff like, I mean, does it actually try to, convert or convince people who actually use Postgres and similar databases, open source databases? I don't know what else is out there, like popular ones, okay? Very, very popular battle-tested production ready databases running at like planet scale or world scale or global scale. Basically, that's what the terms are. So how does it say something like, hey, you can actually use us instead of Postgres, though MariaDB is backed by a company and owned by a company, but I mean, it's still open source, and we are very, very open source friendly and whatnot. But will the open source people who are hardcore open source people believe it and take it? What will their worry be? And do these people in MariaDB and other companies convince in other companies that are backing or that are owning and backing open source database projects or any such project in general, gentrification of this whole problem, right? How do they convince and say, I understand that this XYZ alternative is an open source project, and it's a community project, and it's not owned by some particular company, owned and backed and funded by some particular company, but and our product is an open source product, open source software, and it's backed by us and owned by us. But though we say owned by us, but I mean, do they say owned by us, or do they say it's open source, so it's owned by everyone and everyone owns it, right? And they can clone it and they can do things. And how does MariaDB and other database companies even try to convince that move to our database? Like MariaDB is a relational database management system, RDBMS, and Postgres, like MariaDB and MySQL Postgres are like popular options. How come they are able to actually tell like, don't use Postgres. These are all relational database management systems. How do they actually differentiate themselves? Like going forward, what do they see the future of DBMS, RDBMS is? And I was wondering, this is gentrification would be like, how does one open source software compete with another open source software? And it's a crazy thing, right? Both are open source. In terms of high level features, it's the same, but then how do they even sell both of them? Both of them are really popular, well used, and whatnot. And especially when it's a company, there's a company behind it, and they want to actually get their customers to actually use their open source software, right? For example, in this case, database specificity of the problem is database, open source databases. Gentrification is any open source software backed by a company name, where they're trying to, or even backed by some person, no company, no funding, but they want to convince the customer or the user that, hey, use my project instead of the other project. And do these people think, like say open source software developers, specifically say open source database developers and companies specifically, where they're running and owning and backing an open source database, do they think that there should be just probably just one open source database or open source software, and everyone should just, like in general, open source software for some specific problem, and everyone should just contribute to that instead of creating, for example, if there is RDBMS, there should just be one open source RDBMS and let everyone contribute to it. Do they see the future of open source RDBMS, for example, to be a merge of, say, MariaDB and Postgres and everything, because everyone is trying to work on some similar set of problems. They solve it in one database, and why reinvent the wheel in another source code, in another software? It's all open source. Why don't you just all put in your efforts? Like 1,000 people are working for, say, MariaDB open source software database, open source database, and say 1,000 people are working, like example, 1,000 people are working for Postgres, open source database. Why can't those people get together and become 2,000 and make the efforts better, right? Channel the energy into just one thing, make it flexible and whatnot? Or do they think, no, every database has its own pros and cons, has its own trade-offs, which is usually the case. Like, I don't know much, but I've heard that MySQL, the way it handles, I think, primary index or secondary indices or indexes, whatever, is different from how Postgres handles primary indices and secondary indices. But there must be many other changes, especially it's totally different implementation, right? So how do they even think about that? And what do they think about the future of databases, right? And databases in general, and then specifically relational databases, right? Because SQL, so many people are moving on to NoSQL. So then, what do they think about SQL and relational database management systems? And what do they think about distributed relational database management systems? For example, Postgres is not natively distributed. You can shard it. I don't know what's the difference there. Like, if you just shard, it's still distributed, but then the data, like, you still have to create replicas of it, but inherently it's not distributed. You have to bring in the distribution part outside of Postgres and somehow bring it in. Like, it's not part of Postgres itself. And is it built to be distributed system friendly? Apparently not, is what I heard. And there are no ideas of active and whatnot. You can shard, and I don't know how sharding works in Postgres well. You can shard, but then there are properly distributed databases built ground up from scratch for distribution, for for distributed systems, with the idea of a distributed database, where at its core it's actually distributed and it's a distributed database, right? So then how do open source databases like Postgres, which are not inherently distributed, or even MariaDB I think is not inherently distributed, how do they compete with such distributed RDBMS, right? And even in RDBMS, how are they able to compete with all these NoSQL and whatnot, where people are just going ahead and trying to model their data and everything using NoSQL as much as possible, even though it can be SQL, and trying to achieve the same performance and get the same features and everything through NoSQL itself, right? So our RDBMS dying, DBMS is like relational database is dying, or is there a great future for it, right? Along with say extensions and whatnot. For example, you want to do some extra thing, you put this extension, it's a plugin. Similar to how Redis has Redis modules and it says you want Redis to be a document data store, sure it will work. You put this Redis JSON module and it will work. And Redis graph, you put this module, called Redis graph, and you get a graph database. You put, I don't know, they even have ideas for even running serverless functions inside Redis. I think it's called Redis Gear or something like that. So you can actually create functions that run inside Redis, I think, and it runs as a function and it runs with basically the processing or the computational work runs in the database close to the database. Instead of bringing the data into a say to the backend server where your microservice is running, basically your microservice, and then basically pull the data from the database into the microservice and then do the processing, and then say put it back or whatever, or show it or do something with it. Instead, they're actually trying to run, I think, the compute process close to the data, and probably you can code it in a language. I think this is similar to telling procedural language, PLSQL and whatnot. But popularly, people have shied away from writing procedural queries and whatnot, and coding everything in the database. They used to do this before, but then now people don't do it because they want to use modern programming languages like Java and whatnot, and or Golang and whatnot, like more modern JavaScript using Node.js runtime, or the newer runtimes that are coming out there like Bun and whatnot. But Redis has this feature, and a lot of people have this idea of running computational work close to the data instead of transporting the data close to the computational process and work, because sometimes you have a lot of data, a lot of say GBs and TBs and gigabytes of data or terabytes of data or petabytes of data on which you need to do computational work. Instead of transferring it all into some compute place, you instead push the computational work close to the data, because transferring data and whatnot is also going to be costly. So yeah, and so Redis has that feature where you can run functions on it, I think. And then they have Redis time series. They have using a module, Redis module. So it's kind of like plugins, basically. Another name they have for that. So they have all these modules, and they even have modules for, I think, stuff like Bloom filter and whatnot. So they have a lot of stuff, right? So will relational databases be like, if you want to do something extra, for example, Postgres has for geospatial stuff, it has, I think, I forgot, like PostGIS, right? It's a extension, I believe, Postgres extension, basically plugin, same concept. You put it in, you install, and you can use geospatial features, like you can store latitude, longitude, and whatnot, I think. And you can use the features of a generic geospatial database, usual features, and I think PostGIS is pretty popular and used by a lot of people, right? And there are so many extensions out there for sharding, for for even doing things like running jobs on Postgres using a cron schedule and whatnot. So basically, this is similar to running computational work where your data is similar to how I said Redis has functions to run in Redis, which are serverless functions and whatnot. It's run and die. So cron jobs also, I believe, it should run and die because it's a job. It's not a long running job. Usually cron jobs, they run and then they die off and they run again and again based on the cron schedule. So it's a repeated thing. So, so relational databases, will they actually start doing more with the help of extensions? Like for example, Timescale has this extension on top of Postgres. So it's a Postgres extension, and you basically have time series feature on Postgres itself, right? And and then there are more extensions probably out there. I think Citus, for example, is an extension for Postgres. Like Citus provides an extension for Postgres for horizontal scaling used by sharding and whatnot. And Citus I think got acquired by Microsoft, by the way, and they're now I think working on Azure cloud, of course. So what about like relational databases? What will happen to them? How will they even tell customers, hey, use more relational databases and use these open source ones especially, right? Because so many people have started using closed source databases, for example, say FaunaDB, right? FaunaDB is one popular thing I've heard. A lot of people have liked it and loved it, and it's really performant is what I've heard. And yeah, I mean, it's closed source. And then there are databases like, say, so many Google Cloud, Azure Cloud databases. Like Azure has Cosmos DB, I think Google has, AWS has DynamoDB. But these are NoSQL. But Amazon also has a relational database service, I think RDS, Aurora RDS and whatnot. And I mean, all of these cloud providers, cloud service providers, or whatever you want to call them, they have so many database services, managed database services with open source databases and closed source databases. For example, Google has a Spanner and then Bigtable, BigQuery, so many things, right, for data stuff. So then, how are these open source companies, like companies which are owning and running and backing open source software, like for example, say open source databases, open source database companies, how are they going to actually compete with these cloud service providers who are creating so many new databases? Do they even think you need more and more databases? Because Google Cloud and I think even Azure Cloud would have created so many databases. I don't know about Amazon. Google Cloud surely has created so many databases. Like I think last I heard was about AlloyDB. So I mean, do you really need another database? And it's closed source. What are the advantages and whatnot? So do these open source database companies think that you need another new database out there? Or should you just build on top of existing databases? Does it make sense? This is basically the whole conversation about, do you build something, or do you build something new, or do you build on something existing? This is a common question for any software, including open source software. So yeah, I mean, what do they think? How can open source database companies even compete with these closed source database companies, say which are only database companies, for example FaunaDB, or example even say cloud service providers, right, where they have managed database services, right? And how are they competing, and do they see a future for them? And so many people are using APIs now. They don't use databases directly. They use, say, Firebase, Supabase and whatnot. They use some SaaS service on top of things. They use databases only for their logic specifically, or sometimes again push that off to some managed service. So many people are using cloud service providers. So at some point, if so many people are using, say, some SaaS API and not a database directly, so some API on top of the database or whatever, or some data thing, or if they're using managed database services by, say, cloud service providers usually, which is a popular thing, then how do these companies, like say database companies, like say open source database companies, which are backing and running and owning an open source software, like say MariaDB or Titanium databases and whatnot, or companies like MyDB Ops or Quadrant or Percona, will they be actually serving cloud service providers instead of customers directly? Will they be actually having cloud service providers as their clients who will be providing, say, MariaDB to their clients? And like MariaDB serves cloud service provider serves the end customer, or the client, and then the client, of course, serves the end customer, whatever. So then, and even then, like, or do you have to do some nasty games like how I think MongoDB did it? I don't know. Elasticsearch also? I'm not sure. Even Redis and even CockroachDB and all, like the licensing nasty stuff that you have to do. Not nasty, but something important that you have to do so that cloud service providers don't run open source databases on their own and don't provide it as a hosted service, managed service, right? Because that way people go to the open source database company itself that is owning the managed database service. So basically the license says you can self-host it for yourself, but you can't self-host it and provide it as a service through network or whatever and provide it as a service to someone else. You can self-host it for your own use case, but you can't for your own SaaS, but you can't host it as a managed service and provide a managed service. Is usually a licensing thing that people are doing in the case of open source database companies, right? So do open source database companies have to do that so that all these cloud service providers don't run the open source database themselves, and then customers will come to open source database companies. But then even then, if cloud service providers like convince people to just use cloud service provider specific, say, closed source database, which is a provided as a managed service. So what do they do? And I mean, so many companies out there. So that's the question I had. So I mean, that's all. But I have some more questions. I'll probably record them in a separate video. Bye.